Welcome back to Costumeco. In today's video, I'll be analyzing the costumes in the Gilded Age Season 3. If you're new here, I have a playlist dedicated to the Gilded Age costumes, including Seasons 2 and 3. I'll leave a pinned comment with a link so you can easily find those. And I also invite you to check out my recent live streams with costume shopper and buyer Jed Rivero, where we had some fun doing a little fashion police segment. And of course, a big thank you to my patrons for supporting me and making this channel possible. Now, before diving into the costumes, I want to share a quick thought about Season 3 as a whole. I've been really enjoying the story, the characters, and all of the gorgeous locations, and of course, the costumes. Now, that said, this season has been especially challenging to analyze because of the sheer number of characters, including several new introductions, which means an even greater number of costumes to explore. So for this video, I'll be taking a slightly different approach, more of a high-level overview. Now, between now and Season 4, I'll also be creating some additional videos that take a closer look at individual characters and costumes. But for now, though, let's get started with the work of costume designer Kasia Walicka-Maimone. The design. I thought I'd start with the overall design because for me, this is the elephant in the room. So depending on who you talk to, some viewers absolutely love the costumes on this show, while others don't connect with them at all. Personally, I land somewhere in the middle. There are costumes I really love, others I don't, and many that I find perfectly fine, particularly the men's and the servants' outfits, which serve the story very well. For the men, George, Oscar, and Dr. Kirkland all had really strong designs. The tailoring on their looks is excellent. I especially wanted to highlight these close-up shots of Oscar's ties, cravats, and pins, which actor Blake Ritson shared on Instagram. They're marvelous. And kudos to Archer and Tailors Limited, who created many of Jack Trotter's and Dr. Kirkland's suits. I also thought that the nightwear for Gladys, George, Bertha, and Agnes was especially lovely. Now, where I start to feel less certain is with the women's gowns. And let's be honest, that's where most of the conversation is happening online. Now, here's my take, and of course, this is just my opinion. I don't connect with the overall design aesthetic of the women's costumes this season. Now, that's unusual for me. If you've watched my channel for a while, you'll know that I usually find myself aligned with the designer's choices, whether that's their palette, fabrics, or construction. On the rare occasion I'm not, I'll often just choose not to cover that project. But in the case of the Gilded Age, I do enjoy analyzing them, even if the aesthetic doesn't appeal to me personally. I want to emphasize that this is a matter of taste. Now, for example, I adored the costumes in Game of Thrones, especially the early seasons, but I've had plenty of comments from my viewers who disagreed, and that's okay. And it's not to say that I don't admire the costume designer's work elsewhere. I thought her designs in The Pale Blue Eye, Moonrise Kingdom, and The Adjustment Bureau were wonderful. Now, with that context, I'd say my personal favorites this season were the costumes worn by the Black Elite in Newport. The pastel palette and silhouettes at their summer ball were beautiful. Even when leaning into later 19th century styles, the men and women looked stunning. Now, in contrast, I struggled with many of the gowns at Bertha's ball. While I appreciate the jewel tone palette as a deliberate visual contrast, some of the colors felt garish, and the silhouettes and draping didn't quite land for me. For example, the gowns worn by Miriam, Aurora, Agnes, and Ada left me a little bit underwhelmed, and I found Mrs. Astor's and Mrs. Fish's gowns particularly difficult to connect with. Historical accuracy. Now that we've looked at the overall aesthetic, let's dive into how these designs relate to the historical period. The season is set in 1884 during what's known as the late bustle era, so naturally the question of historical accuracy comes up often. Again, in my comments, I see two camps. Some viewers take issue with inaccuracies, while others respect the familiar line, "It's not a documentary." Personally, I don't expect the Gilded Age costumes to be strictly accurate, especially since the show itself takes an anachronistic approach. Which brings us back to the bigger design question. Are the showrunners and the costume team trying to present the period through a modern lens, or aiming for historical silhouettes but pulling back before full authenticity? To me, it's not entirely clear, and I don't think the vision has been firmly defined. Now, that said, I do think the costumes sometimes succeed in telling us something about the characters, which is ultimately their most important job. To frame the discussion, I want to point out that many of the designs are rooted in three main historical sources: photographs and paintings of the era, extant garments in museums and auction houses, and fashion plates. Sometimes the costume designer creates a close replica. Other times they borrow elements like a silhouette or detail and then reinterpret with different fabrics, colors, or trims. Now here are a few season 3 examples. Bertha Russell's Red Opera Ball gown, worn in the season finale, was inspired by a House of Worth gown from 1898 to 1900. Since that's later than the 1884 setting, the show adjusted the skirt and added a bustle while swapping the original tomato red velvet for a summery red brocade. Dorothy Scott's luxurious ball gown drew from a Worth gown dated between 1886 to 1887, while Peggy Scott's ballet pink gown echoes John Singer Sargent's 1898 portrait of Lisa Colt. And thank you to the Corseted Beauty on Instagram for these references. Peggy's pink silk and burgundy dress, repeated from season 1, is an accurate replica of an 1885 to 1886 day dress from the Goldstein Museum of Design. And several of Gladys's costumes also reference history. The most talked about is the gown she wore to pose for John Singer Sargent in the season 3 premiere, based on Giovanni Boldini's portrait of Concha de Ossa. Other looks, like her blue plaid traveling outfit, white floral garden dress, and lemon yellow dinner gown, all draw from 1890s French fashion plates. So if the costumes do have historical roots, why do some of them still feel off? For me, it usually starts with the foundation garments. In the 1880s, the ideal silhouette relied on underpinnings, corsets worn over chemises, corset covers, bustles, bust and hip padding built into gowns. As we see in the behind-the-scenes images in the Gilded Age, corsets are worn over tank tops and without correct underpinnings, and the additional padding. This is especially noticeable on Marian. Her corset ridge often shows through her gowns, particularly in her purple velvet day and lace dress with a corselet and her pink and white Mary Poppins-style Newport dress. Closures are another giveaway. While button fronts were common for day wear, hooks and eye closures were usually hidden. In the show, we sometimes see center back fastenings that break up delicate overlays, like Gladys's floral garden dress, when historically they would have been concealed. I'll give production some leeway here, with wigs and makeup stepping into costumes is practical, but plackets could have easily hidden those closures. Meanwhile, fabric and color are perhaps the biggest immersion breakers. Modern fabrics, even expensive ones, are produced with contemporary milling and dyes, so they rarely look 19th century. And I should point out that I'm not a historian here, but I have spoken to some designers that have worked with local mills in places like England and Scotland to create historically accurate fabric. That said, there are some exceptions. Bertha's abstract floral day dress, first seen in season 2, was inspired by this French House A Fanet circa 1885 gown on display at the Met, and Agnes's emerald green visiting gown recalls a Charles Frederick Worth gown circa 1890 to 93 from Carey Taylor auction. On the flip side, some of the choices felt jarringly modern. Two of Gladys's English costumes stood out to me: the teal and red tea gown with modern lace and the lemon yellow cloquet gown trimmed with metallic lace. While the silhouettes were mostly correct, the fabrics felt otherworldly, almost like they belonged in a different production. Ultimately, with the thousands of costumes to produce each season, historical milling or hand-woven fabrics just aren't realistic for this show. That said, I did notice more costume repeats in season 3. Bertha, Agnes, and Marian all wore some day looks multiple times, which I actually appreciated for the added realism. Now, before we move on, I just want to thank my patrons again. Their support makes these deep dives possible, me spending hours researching, cross-referencing extant garments, and uncovering behind-the-scenes details. If you'd like to support the channel and get access to bonus content, sneak peeks, and behind-the-scenes updates, you can join me over on Patreon. I'll leave the link in the description below. Every bit of support keeps these costume videos coming. Now back to the video. The construction. Beyond the design, let's take a look at how these costumes are actually made. Because of the sheer volume of costumes needed, some of the gowns can look rushed or a little ill-fitting, especially when the actors are seated, when bodices sometimes bunch or ride up under the arms. Now, that's sort of understandable though, given the scale of production and the challenge of making hundreds of costumes for both principal and background characters. Most of the costumes are custom made, but the design team also works with outside ateliers to keep up with the demand. Many of these makers share behind-the-scenes process photos on Instagram, from muslin toiles to finished gowns, which gives us a fascinating look at the work involved. One of the best-known collaborators is New York costume maker Eric Winterling, who I've had on the channel before. In addition to the Gilded Age, Eric created many of Midge Maisel's costumes for The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. For Season 3 of The Gilded Age, he was behind several standout looks, including Bertha's fur-trimmed dress from the season opener, Enid's purple gown, her dark green half-mourning ball gown worn in the finale, and Miriam's ball gown. The legendary Torelli costumie in Rome also contributed. They've worked on productions like Penny Dreadful and Marie Antoinette, and in Season 3, they made Bertha's silver gray brocade gown with gold satin accents, her red ball gown, Gladys's walking suit with the short fur cape, and most notably, Gladys's wedding gown. And I've done a dedicated video on that dress, which I'll link below if you'd like a deep dive. Paris Costumes in Madrid also supply pieces, though they haven't shared behind-the-scenes photos on Instagram. Another collaborator was By Baroque, a Jersey City costume house run by Baroque Stribling. They've created many of Agnes's new looks for Season 3, including her light purple day dress for Gladys's wedding, with scrollwork motifs that look like soutache but are actually embroidery, her emerald green and gold day dress, her silvery gray dress worn in the dress shop, and her green feather gown inspired by a Worth design. They also produced Mamie Fish's Newport gown. The costume team modified 2 of her earlier costumes made by Baroque with new trims for Season 3. French corset and costume maker Jérôme Deléger contributed looks for many of the secondary characters, for instance, Charlotte Astor's dresses, including her season finale ball gown, Mrs. Foster of the New York Heritage Society, Mrs. Brown's purple gown, and Joan Carlton's looks. Associate costume designer Patrick Wiley worked with Deléger on background costumes in Season 2, including this gown that appears inspired by an 1885 ensemble from the Met. Finally, Yuriko Costumes in New York created several pieces in Season 3, including Maud Beaton's green gown from the House of Ill Repute, her floral traveling dress, and Bridget's sweet mauve visiting dress from the finale. So that wraps up my look at the costumes of the Gilded Age Season 3. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which costumes stood out to you this season, and did you find yourself connecting with the design choices, or not so much? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to check out my playlist on the Gilded Age costumes, along with my live streams and interviews with makers who worked on the show. And as always, a huge thank you to my patrons for supporting this channel and making this kind of content possible. Thank you for spending time with me. I'll see you in the next video.